Hello everyone, welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel and today we'll be covering my round 2 game from the Scarborough Chess Championship. So this game happened a little bit more recently and I was again playing the black pieces, and let's take a look at what happened. Actually in this game I ended up getting paired against actually a good friend of mine. We've played before in the past, like online. This was actually our second ever officially rated game, actually at the same venue even. The first one I was completely winning. He was also completely winning, and then it ended up, it was supposed to be a draw, but then I ended up spoiling it with low time, and he actually ended up winning that game. So now let's see if I can actually get my revenge here and win this game. So my opponent this time opens with d4. Last time he went with e4, and I got completely crushed in a couple of moves, but this time d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, knight c3, castles, g3, d6, bishop g2, knight b to d7, castles, c6, e4, all pretty standard theory, nothing really special here. Queen c7, basically the point with this knight on d7, this queen on c7, and this pawn on d6, this sort of weird square structure here is to try to push e5. It's a pretty typical plan here in this system with the fianchetto bishop. Queen c2. Queen c2 is a little bit less commonly seen. Typically a move like bishop e3 is something I see, and then after the move e5, d5, here's something like knight c5 is possible to target this pawn here on d4, or sorry, on e4, and then now queen c2, and then something like a5 to prevent b4, and then the move h3 to prevent the move bishop g4 developing this bishop. So instead my friend switched up the move order, played queen c2 first, and then here I play e5, d5, and here knight b6, targeting this c4 pawn. And this actually has some very interesting intentions. One of the points is that after b3, which is what I expected, c takes d5, the only good way to take back is actually to play e takes d5, and then I had another move planned here. The point being is that all other captures have a downside. Knight takes d5 is very easy to see. After something like knight f captures on d5, pawn captures on d5, and a move like e4, white is going to lose material here because the rook on a1 is attacked by the bishop on g7, and the knight on f3 is attacked at the same time. And there's no way to really block this attack, also moving the knight at the same time, because then the bishop would simply take. At the same time here, if you play pawn captures on e5, then I have this move knight captures on e4. There are two ways that you can capture this knight, but none of them are good. Knight takes e4 very simply loses a queen. And here, if queen takes on e4, this queen is no longer protecting this knight here on c3. Very simply, queen captures on c3 would be winning back the piece, plus interest since I also won a pawn. This rook on b1 is under fire, and here I can probably corral this d5 pawn as well, play a move like bishop f5, f5, e4, and probably just end up winning the game that way. So e takes d4 is the most logical. And here I actually ended up thinking for 20-ish minutes. Now the reason why is because I ended up actually finding the best move in this position, which is this knight sacrifice and knight captures on d5. And the point is that this looks like I'm giving up a piece for 2 pawns, however I'm actually able to win the piece back. And this variation is quite complicated. So the initial point is obviously I'm attacking this knight twice, and it's defended only once. You can't take this knight because very simply queen captures on c2 just wins the queen for 2 pieces. So a queen and 2 pawns for 2 pieces, which is completely winning for black. And the secondary point is obviously I'm currently attacking the knight, so I'm obviously threatening to take on the next move. And so the move that I obviously looked at were bishop d2 and bishop to b2. Bishop to d2 was pretty easy to sort of evaluate because after the move e4, opening up another attacker and attacking this knight. After a move like knight h4, and let's say knight captures on c3, I was mainly worried about the move rook c1. However, I realized after knight e2 check, king h1, and something like queen captures on c2, rook captures on c2, and a move like simply knight back to d4, probably going to knight f3 soon. Black is just completely winning here, up 2 pawns, and these 2 pawns are very central, and this d pawn is also a passed pawn. And the reason why bishop d2 in all these cases leads to this is because this bishop here cuts off the queen from being able to control the e2 square. So any position here where, like, let's say the knight goes to g5, pretty much the same story. If you bring this rook, it's still knight e2 check. This queen still can't take the knight because the bishop's in the way. So if my opponent played bishop d2, I would be very happy. It'd be very easy to play. The more complicated variation was to calculate bishop to b2, because now in all of those variations, when knight e2 check would hit, queen captures on e2 would be an option. So here after bishop b2, very easy to see the next move. e4 has to be played to win the piece back somehow. Now I have 3 attackers on the piece, and this is a double attack, so I'm going to be able to win my piece back. It's just whether I can win my piece back and be completely fine. Because there are some variations where some of these pieces end up being a bit loose, or in some variations there's a rook c1 move to pin the piece that captured here on c3, because my queen is on the same file, and then somehow when my piece moves out of the way, they're able to play queen takes c7, knight takes c7, and rook takes c7. Sort of to illustrate the point here, let's say knight g5, bishop captures on c3, rook c1. Actually, we'll use knight captures on c3, it illustrates it better. Rook c1, this is still fine for black, by the way, but to illustrate, let's say a move like, so currently there's 3 attackers on this knight, there's 2 defenders, let's say I move the knight, then here this would be completely losing after something like this, because not only have I lost the piece that I just won, I'm also down, like I also sacrificed the piece initially, meaning that I have 2 pieces for the pawn. Obviously in this case there is bishop captures on b2, so this doesn't fully illustrate the point, but the idea is there in the sense that sort of in some positions I'm able to actually end up losing this queen, like here for example queen d2 just wins the piece back, because, and this illustrates sort of what I was saying with how my pieces are very loose. Here best is queen e7, because currently there's a double attack here. Queen e7 to attack this knight, but just simply queen captures, sorry, not queen captures on d5, because that would hang the bishop. Firstly, bishop captures on g7, king takes, and now queen captures on d5, and this also defends the knight on g5 at the same time. So that sort of illustrates how easily my position could fall apart. Thankfully, I calculated everything back when I initially sacrificed the knight here with knight takes on d5, and here I knew that any move that my opponent played, I would have a defense. Firstly, let's look at basically all the knight moves, because that's sort of all the moves I calculated. Knight g5, I realized that here, basically I could take it 2 ways. I realized that taking with the bishop is the less risky option and is kind of my fail-safe. In case something doesn't work out, I can always play bishop captures on c3, because I realized that anytime my opponent tries to line up like sort of the rook and the queen on the same file, I always have the move bishop captures on b2. Point being, I just took a bishop, so if you take this way, like this, then I obviously took a bishop to begin with, so I'm fine with losing a piece here because it's just basically an equal trade. And at this point, I would play d5 and I would be up 2 extra pawns. So I knew bishop captures on c3 is always a fail-safe here. What I was calculating was the more ambitious move knight captures on c3. Because the point with knight captures on c3 is it gets out of the way of this d pawn, so in some variations I can play d5. Also, the knight on c3 is just on a great post in general. Also, this knight on c3 also provides some defense to the e4 pawn, which could be useful in some variations. So after knight g5, I calculated knight captures on c3, but here I realized this is probably a bit worse for black because of this following variation. Knight captures on e4, I can't take this knight because queen captures on c7. So obviously here I have to play a move like knight back to d5, let's say. Then after queen captures on c7, knight captures on c7, bishop takes on g7, king takes, and knight captures on d6. I realize that this position is quite passive for black, because currently this knight on d6 pressures both the c8 bishop as well as this b7 pawn. So I have to defend both with a move like rook b8. But after rook a to c1 to target these 2 pieces, after a move like knight e6, let's say, knight captures on c1, knight captures on c8, sorry, rook captures on c8, rook takes, and bishop captures on b7. I do get some activity with rook c2, however, I fear that this isn't sufficient, because after a move like a4, rook c3, simply bishop d5 just holds these 2 pawns together, and white can simply just say they're up a pawn, and they also have a bishop for a knight. So I didn't really like this option if my opponent played the move knight g5. So I was trying to find some alternatives. I knew obviously if knight g5 I would probably have to go with my failsafe bishop captures on c3. So I started looking at what other moves my opponent could play. So I already had this move already calculated, so I know now move on to the next. Obviously knight d4 and knight e5 are illogical because both of these squares just hang the piece. So here I calculated the move knight h4. Knight h4 I knew wasn't good. Knight h4 I had basically 2 ways to take. I could take probably with the bishop or the knight. I calculated knight captures on c3, and here if like rook a to c1, then I could probably just play something like, I don't know, I calculated something like bishop to d7, because the point being is my opponent can win the piece back. However, after a move like rook a to c8, actually rook f to c8, sorry, my opponent can't play bishop captures on g7 because then queen takes, and rook takes. And here, basically, the material count is that, and let's say bishop to d4 here. And the material count here is basically I have a rook for 2 pieces. However, the issue is this piece on the edge, the knight, is very passive, and a move like g5 just basically simply traps it. The knight has no jumps. Thankfully, there is the move bishop captures on e4, which does save the day. But sort of you can see the point where this knight gets trapped. However, I still didn't really like this with knight takes because I thought the position could get a little bit wonky at some points. So here my option was probably to play bishop takes. And here if a move like rook a to c1, then bishop captures on b2 still works. Queen captures on b2, then just very simply queen e7, defend this pawn, and now I'm actually threatening the move g5 because there's no more bishop captures on e4. And also if queen takes, knight takes, and rook takes, very simply a move like f5 to defend this pawn chain here. I'm threatening g5 next. This knight is actually going to be completely trapped. Bishop e5 next, and this is just completely winning for black. So those are the 2 moves I had already calculated. Next, I moved on to knight d2 and knight to e1. Knight to e1 I knew immediately was very illogical because it blocks in this rook on f1, which in some variations could end up being the rook behind the queen, because maybe this rook has some purpose here on a1. And I realized here probably just knight bishop captures on c3 again just works because after bishop takes, now I have queen captures on c3 in this case. And after queen takes, knight takes, I'm threatening some knight e2 check. I'm also defending the e4 pawn. Rook c1 can simply be met by knight e2 check, forking the king and the rook, and I'm very simply winning there. And the final move I had to calculate was knight d2. After knight d2 here, I realized knight captures on c3 can lead to the same variation as we saw when the knight went to g5 with something like knight back to d4, knight queen takes, knight takes, bishop takes, king takes, and knight captures on d6. Same position as when the knight went to g5, so I knew that wasn't good. So bishop captures on c3 would probably be what I play. Rook a c1, bishop takes, queen takes, and after queen e7, knight takes e5, probably bishop f5, hitting the knight so that there's no knight f6 tricks in the future. Here maybe rook fe1, and probably something like queen to d7, sliding out of the way. This position is probably a bit better for white because of white's activity, even though black is up a pawn, but there is still some sufficient compensation. So after reading through all of these variations, I played the move e4, my opponent plays knight g5, and here I just simply play bishop captures on c3. Here, knight captures on e4 was played, I play bishop takes on b2, queen takes, and here I play bishop f5, a very important move. Let's say I play a move like queen to e7 here. Then white here is actually already completely winning. The reason why is because after a move like, let's say, rook a to d1 even, my position is going to be completely lost. Best I have here is the move bishop to f5, at which point there's rook captures on d5, bishop takes, and queen takes, and after rook captures on d6, white probably wins back their pawn, and they probably have a bit more activity. Another line is actually here rook e1, and then here I have to probably sacrifice my queen, and this is going to be probably lost for black. So going back here, so it's very important that I play this move bishop f5 because this knight coming to f6 is always a major threat. Like sort of a more extreme example of this is something like this. Let's say I play rook f to d1, and let's say I play the move queen e6. Then here white can even play the move rook captures on d5. This is kind of an extreme example of this, but this will probably lead to actually checkmate because let's say after a move like king g7, knight captures on d5 check, king g8, knight f6, king h8, knight h5, king g8, queen g7 is very simply checkmate, supported by this knight here on h5. And this all stems to that basically my position is held together purely by this knight on d5. And if I don't find a way to trade off, like if I don't find a way to get rid of this knight on e4 as soon as possible, this knight on d5 will get attacked on the next move and my position will fall apart. So bishop f5 is very critical to prevent knight f6 at some point. Here rook a to c1, and here I play queen e7, setting up a double attack against this knight. And here, after some thought, my friend actually inexplicably played the move knight captures on d6, and this is actually a complete blunder. After queen captures on d6, I'm not too sure what my opponent miscalculated here. He told me after the game that he miscalculated something with the move rook c5 at some point, which we'll get to in a second. Basically, the point is that now my opponent tries to set up a pin here with the move queen to d4, pinning this knight to the queen. This knight can't move because then I would drop a queen. So now I simply have to play the move rook f to d1 to defend. And here after a move like rook c to rook f to d1, this is what my opponent miscalculated. and bishop e6, they thought that they had the move rook to c5 here. However, here I actually do have a move, which is actually the move, here I actually do have a move which is something like rook a to c8, which I calculated in the game. The point being is that if you play bishop captures on d5 here, very simply, rook captures on c5 just wins the game. Now I'm attacking this bishop, and I have a counter pin against my opponent's queen and rook, because this bishop can't move out of the way to defend this queen. So, and alternatively, if you play rook captures on d5, thinking you can win 2 pieces for the rook, after bishop captures on d5, bishop captures on d5, here I can very simply play the move queen to b6, getting out of the way of the attack. And here, let's say queen captures on b6, pawn captures on b6, and something like bishop to f3. Rook takes and bishop takes, and here I very simply have rook c1, pinning the bishop to the king and just winning the game. So instead in the game, my opponent actually ended up playing rook c to d1 using the other rook. So I knew this was an easier option for me to play because there was no more rook c5 threat at any point. So I just played bishop e6, rook d2, here rook d7. Here I do give my opponent a pawn here with queen captures on a7. However, I think this is a more practical decision because after queen a6 and queen to c5, you can't play queen to d4 here because this just this is bad because of like something like knight f6, for example. Point being, on queen captures on f6, you can play rook captures on d2, rook takes, and you've won an exchange. So my opponent can't go queen to d5, they have to go queen to c5 here, and here I very simply again have knight f6, trading off all the rooks here. After rook captures on d7, rook takes, and bishop takes. This queen defends this knight here on f6. My knight defends this bishop. Everything in black's position is well defended. This pawn defends the queen too. And basically, black's position is completely winning. I knew this for sure. Once the rooks came off the board, I knew it should be a win. It's just simply a matter of conversion. So here, queen to c2, defend the a2 pawn. Here I play queen to b6. I was a bit low on time here, so I just had to play a move. This move also prevents queen c7, targeting this b7 pawn. So here h3, I just play king g7, defend this knight in case my queen has to go off somewhere. Queen to b2, and here I play bishop c6. Point being, I could have played bishop c6 here. I considered it all the way back here. However, I thought that since I was a little bit lower on time, I knew this was still completely winning. However, I didn't want to give my opponent any counterplay chances with this extra a pawn, especially considering this king is going to be able to run faster up the board, especially since it's white's move. And I knew I had an extra knight which could blockade this pawn, but I just didn't want to have any practical chances for my opponent. So I played something a bit more sort of safe, queen b6, and then I waited for the queen to get off of the c-file, and then I played bishop c6. Because now after bishop takes, I can very simply play queen takes, and there is no pass pawn that is generated on the a-file because my pawn's still on b7. So here my opponent plays a4, sorry, trying to generate a pass pawn. I play h5. I'm threatening, because I have an extra piece, I realize I can probably go for some type of an attack that can probably break through. So here, king h2, I play queen f3, targeting f2. b4 here, I play king h7, preparing knight to e4 because the queen was pinning the knight to my king. Here, queen to a2, setting up an attack against the f7 pawn. I simply play knight e4 because the queen also defends f7. Here, king g1 to defend f2. And here, it's a very disappointing mistake that I didn't play the move h4 here. h4 just straight up just wins the game. Point being that I bust open white's king side, and there's no hope in saving that position because it will probably lead to checkmate soon after. Sample line is g captures on h4. Let's say I play king g8, threatening queen captures on h3. Here, I even have knight c3, knight e2, and knight to f4 here. Let's say b5, knight c3, queen b2, knight e2 check. Let's say king to h2, and here very simply knight f5 just wins the game, threatening queen to g2 checkmate, and there's no way to actually stop it besides from giving up your queen, and then I get checkmate. So this is sort of how dangerous the position can become. However, inexplicably, I played the move knight g4 thinking I was still breaking through, but after the move h4, I realized I can't actually do anything. If I play knight h3 check after king f1, the best I saw was queen d1 check, king g2, and queen g1. You can't take this knight because queen h1 is just simply checkmate. And best I saw is simply I can make my opponent's king run out, but I realized this knight is actually trapped on the edge of the board. There's no way to actually get it out. So I didn't go for this. Instead, I realized, okay, I admit my mistake. I have to go back, knight back to e6. Here, queen to a1, and then here I simply play king g8. Here I'm kind of, we're getting both lower on time, so here I'm just kind of blitzing out some moves, queen b3, queen e1, queen to c4, just simply halting any progress here on the queen side. King to b2, or king to g2, queen to b5 to get in front of the pawns. Queen to d2, queen c6 check. Here I'm just trying to gain more time, so here's a lot of shuffling here. And actually around here we actually ended up stopping like notation basically, and from pretty much this point onwards it's just all memory. Like the rest of the game is pretty reconstructed from my memory, so there are some moves that are a bit inaccurate, but we'll let it slide. Queen g5 threatening b5, knight back to c7 to defend, queen d8 check, king h7, queen f8, queen to e6 here. Queen to c5, knight a6, queen to c3. Here I play queen to c6, offering a queen trade because I realize queen takes, pawn takes. This pawn can't be defended. You can't play b5 because simply pawn takes. So here I'm okay with the pass a pawn because my knight's also blockading. Queen b6. Here I just play king g8, queen to d3, and here I take this pawn on b4 because I realize queen d8. Here I don't have to play king g7 because this will lead to a draw with queen d4 picking up the knight. Instead, I can play king h7, and here queen e7 is the best my opponent can do, targeting both of these points. I play queen c5, and after queen captures on b7, I play knight a6, blockading this pawn, and I realize I have a very interesting plan here. Everything in black's position is already defended, and the only thing I have to get rid of is this a5 pawn. Then black is just comfortably winning, because this a5 pawn is the only threat. However, I can't really corral it with either the queen or the knight, because both of these have to serve a defensive purpose. So I realize the one piece I can use is my king. Since everything in my position is held together by my queen, I don't really have to worry about my queen being attacked. So you'll see I slowly, over the next couple of moves, I start bringing my king in. Everything's defended, so I'm not really concerned. Here queen b7, and here I pick up the a5 pawn. And here I start defending, and now I've already picked up the a5 pawn, so I knew my position was very good. King c7, and here you'll realize I bring my king all the way back to safety. And after queen to b7, here I start moving my queen and maneuvering my knight. Here knight to e4, knight to e5 to prevent queen h8 check, queen c2, and here I play knight f3 check, king f1, and here queen to b5 check. Also going back to here, king f1 is the only good move. If you go to king h1, then simply knight e2 just picks up, knight e1 just picks up the queen. So here knight f3, king f1, and after queen b5 check, here the best my opponent can do is just simply play queen e2, trade the queens, at which point I have an extra knight. I should be able to win that even with low time. And my opponent went for the other option, which is king to g2, at which point I have knight e1 check. And here my opponent resigned the game, seeing as I'm forking the king as well as the queen. I will be up a queen and a knight, and that is very simply winning for black. So, very long and grueling game. In fact, I remember actually at the venue, this was the last game to finish by like around 20-ish minutes, I was pretty sure. Like the last game's already finished, and then me and my friend were just playing on and on and on, and then at the very end I managed to squeeze out a victory. So yeah, quite a long and grueling game. I would say I think I played relatively well. I'm very happy with this knight sacrifice I found early on in the game with knight b captures on d5, and then this just basically wins a pawn, and then later on my opponent thankfully blundered, allowing me to convert a very long and however very smooth game. Yep, so thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys in my round 3 recap of the Scarborough Chess Championship.